Hello everybody, my name is SirPumpkn, and today I'm going to be going over how to make a deck and what makes a good deck. So first thing first, we go into Workshop and we're going to see all of our current decks. You're going to have the starter decks at the top and then any decks that you've made before. So to create a new deck, you're going to click on Create Deck here, and you're going to be given 6 options in terms of gods. Starting off, we have God of War. This leader is primarily going to focus on clearing the board with its Blitz God ability, giving a unit blitz and making favorable trades, as well as having a late game with relics, allowing you to smash your opponent in the face towards the end. Next, we have the Goddess of Nature. This god is going to focus on playing a mid-range deck and basically putting units on the board. A lot of the times, the units that you are playing are going to be overstatted units, with the downside of being confused, just to keep these cards in balance, as well as having the ability to burst heal your god if you so choose to. Next, we have God of Magic. This god is typically going to be playing a more control-oriented deck. It has a lot of board clears at its disposal, as well as mana ramp. Mana ramp is the ability to accelerate your mana so that you can get into that mid to late game and focus on board control and your late game power plays. Next, we have God of Light. This god is going to focus on buffing its creatures and healing them, as well as taking down larger units if you so choose to. Our next leader is going to be the Goddess of Death. This leader is going to focus on playing a very aggressive deck. It has 2 different god abilities to do this, as well as it can also play it as more of a control late game deck. This deck is going to have fewer early game options. However, the late game is going to give it a large chunk of healing, as well as some massive units that are typically going to destroy any kind of control deck. And last but certainly not least, we have the Goddess of Deception. This leader focuses on outplaying your opponent and playing very deceptively, hence the name. This leader is probably going to be the most difficult to master, just because when you do play certain cards, there are typically going to be different ways you can utilize those cards, and finding out the best way to do so can be difficult. Choose the god you want. Let's say I want to play Ludia. From here, I then get to start putting cards into my deck. So very simply, if you want to put this card into your deck, you just click on it. Very straightforward. You can scroll to keep finding cards. You can use these filters up here to filter out certain cards. So if we want to go to 2 mana, we can start going to 2 mana. We want to go to 4 mana, we start going to 4 mana. We want to keep going, we go all the way to 6, we can go all the way to 9+, right? The idea is you got lots of different filters. If you're looking for specific cards, you can search for it and add the card directly. Once you're done building a deck, we'll go ahead and just fill the deck with random cards, right? Obviously, this is not how you build your average deck. You're going to actually be reading what cards do, but once you've finished building your deck, you're going to go to Edit Deck, you're going to put in the name or the title of your deck, save changes, save deck, and you're done. It's that simple. From there, you can go back into the arena and start playing Constructed, start playing Casual, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, that's how to build a deck. The next thing is, what exactly makes a good deck? So now you know how to build a deck, but what do I put in my deck? And to me, a good deck is a deck that has a good game plan in mind. So one of the most common game plans is going to be a more aggressive deck. These decks typically are very, very low curve. If you look at this, we have a ton of 1s, a few 2s, and then it starts to drop off and we have nothing above 4 mana. The basic idea is we're swarming the board very quickly. We're playing lots of cheap minions. We're trying to overwhelm my opponent. And from there, we're just going to kill them. The type of mulliganing you're going to do when you're playing a deck like this is you're going to be looking for 1s and 2s and typically mulligan everything else. And you're basically just playing to your curve every turn. You're going to be using all your mana, and you're just going to hope to beat out your opponent very, very quickly. You have cards like Sing Song Satyr, which is quite good because you are flooding the board very aggressively. So on turn 4, 5, 6, you can play this card and it buffs all your onboard units, which is very good for a deck that's swarming. So this type of deck, your mana curve is typically going to be very, very early. You're looking for a lot of 1s into a lot of 2s, and then not very many 3s and 4s. You can play maybe a 5 over here if you'd like to, but you don't really want to be playing these late game cards just because the goal of the deck is to rush down your opponent's face as fast as possible and kill them. expensive cards you can't really play, so they're just going to take up space in your hand, so you're going to want very cheap units. Yeah. So another type of deck that you'll hear is called mid-range. Mid-range decks are usually going to be playing aggressively early, so that they can beat other aggressive decks like the one that we just showed. However, they typically have a little bit more late game. So in the aggro deck that I just showed, we had 1 through 4s. This deck we have some 5s and 6s. So this is going to do better in a mid to late game against like an aggro deck than say an aggro versus aggro deck. The other nice thing with this deck is it is aggro-ish, so against a control deck it can do quite well in the early game if your opponent can't deal with it. However, mid-range decks can start to fall off against control decks if, well, they get controlled. If your opponent is able to consistently remove your threats every single turn, you're probably going to lose. So when you're building a mid-range deck, the most amount of cards you're going to have are 2s. 2s are typically going to be the most common. You do want to play a few 1s just because having that 1-drop early on can be very, very helpful against other aggro decks. But 2s are going to be where the majority of your cards are going to be. The reason for this is you can play them on turn 1 by playing a bag of tricks, coining it out. You can play this on turn 2. You can play it on turn 3 by playing another bag of tricks with like your God Power, maybe another 2-drop. So 2s are just really, really good, really, really common. If you're playing any kind of mid-range deck, you're going to have a lot of 2s. So 2s, fantastic. They're much better than 3s a lot of the times. 3s in this game are kind of weak, with the exception of Viking Bloodguard. Bloodguard is probably one of the stronger 3s in the game. You're going to see this in basically every kind of aggro or mid-range deck because it's not only a body, but it's a body that once dies still leaves bodies on the board, which is going to be very good for cards like Sing Song. Another thing is when you're building decks, you're going to want to have synergies. So if you notice, we're playing Jungle Princesses, which put more units on the board, which is obviously very good for Sing Song. If your opponent wipes your board, you can redevelop a board with something like Jungle Princess, and then you have the ability to buff these units back up and keep trading into your opponent's units. Or if you want to, you can continue to go face. You do want a few 6s. You don't want too many, just because getting to 7 mana takes pretty long. But you do want some 6s so that you can keep up against other mid-range decks, and so that you kind of have a mid to late game against aggro decks. The final deck is going to be a control deck. This deck has the fewest early game cards. If you notice, there's a lot of expensive cards, or maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there's more. There's more than 0. If you notice, there are a bunch of 2-drops. 2-drops are very, very good. And then after that, you kind of just want to curve. So I didn't talk about curve too much, but essentially in something like an aggro deck, you want to be playing something every single turn, and you want to be spending all your mana. So ideally you play like 2 1-drops on turn 1 with coin, or a 1-drop, and then the next turn you play like a 2-drop, and then the next turn you play maybe a 2-drop and a 1-drop, or maybe you coin out a 4-drop, right? The idea is to expend all your mana every single turn. The goal of a control deck is to not lose the early game, kind of survive against aggro decks, and then have these giant board clears like Asterisk Implosion, which does 6 damage to a unit and then 3 to the rest. This is a very significant board clear card. Typically aggro decks, if this hits an aggro deck and they can't recoup, they lose. So control decks are looking to have some early game so that they don't get completely blown out by aggro decks, a little bit of mid game, and then some late game. How much late game you have is kind of dependent on the meta. If you're queuing into, or you're facing against a lot of very aggressive decks, you're not going to want to run too much late game, just because those cards are dead in your hand until you get to that point, and in some cases the game might be over by turn 5, turn 6, so like your 7, 8, 9 cards, you can't play them, right? So you don't want too many. On the flip side, if you're playing against like mid-range or control decks and you're queuing into them fairly often, you're going to want some more late game, because, well, you're going to have to outvalue your opponent, and the best way to do that is by playing, well, more expensive cards typically. So how you build your deck is going to depend on what your game plan is, right? So the 3 most common are going to be aggro, right? Where you go very wide, you play lots of units very quickly. Your second one is going to be mid-range, which is aggro-ish, but has some more mid-game options on the 5 and 6 options. And then a control deck, which is going to have some early game so it doesn't get completely blown out by aggro, but it also has a decent amount of late game and board clears so that it can keep the board intact and have some finishers for those matchups and for control matchups. Yeah, that's going to be your basic deck building tips. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Good luck with your decks, and I'll see you guys around.